next topic. India's relations with Africa. So there have been some questions that have been asked from India Africa in the past in the main exam. Please write down the questions. Question number 1. Discuss the different phases of India's relationship with Africa. Discuss the different phases of India's relationship with Africa. And identify the core changes in each phase. Identify the core changes in each phase. Question number 2. How has India's relationship with Africa changed in the post-Cold War period? From the Cold War. Question number 3. What is the significance of Africa? For the foreign policy of India? Question number 4. What is the basis of India's Africa policy? Discuss the core features. In the same question, discuss the core features of the diplomatic policy of India. With Africa. So these are some of the major questions that have been asked in the last 7 to 8 years from Africa. So let us try to understand the relationship now. India's relation with Africa can be traced back to the ancient times. In the ancient times, India and Africa witnessed basically maritime trade. And this maritime trade that happened between India and Africa was basically between the west coast of India and the east coast of Africa. The west coast of India is geographically closer to the east coast of Africa. So please go home and see that in the atlas also very carefully. The two areas, that is the west coast of India, east coast of Africa, are geographically proximate to each other. Because of that geographical proximity, ancient times witnessed maritime trade. Because of this maritime trade in the ancient times, in the medieval times, we began to see the rise of a coastal diaspora. The word important here is called diaspora. Diaspora basically means persons of Indian origin living in Africa or living in any other country. What does diaspora mean? Diaspora means persons of Indian origin living in a foreign territory. So those people of Indian origin who live in the foreign territory are basically called as diaspora. If Indian people are living in a foreign territory, we say they are called Indian diaspora. So in the medieval times, we saw the rise of a coastal diaspora. That means that there were people of India who began to settle down in the east coast of Africa. And because these people began to settle down in the east coast of Africa, the eastern coast of Africa is one of the areas in Africa which still today witnesses tremendous number of Indian people living there. So if you have a look at the picture of diaspora in India and Africa today, present day time. And please remember two things. That number one, maximum Indian people today live in East Africa. That is, maximum amount of Indian diaspora exists in East Africa. Some diaspora is found in West, North, and South Africa, and almost no diaspora is today found in Central Africa. This is the present day scenario of the diaspora. Maximum diaspora lives in East Africa. Why? Because of the ancient trade and because of the medieval times, people settling down there. One area where we don't have any diaspora in African region is called the Central Africa. That is why you see this is the first limitation of India's engagement with Africa. Why is it called as a limitation? Because you see, whenever we have diaspora living in a particular territory, the diaspora always acts as a bridge between the relationship of two states. If India has good diaspora in US today, and if India-US have a deep relationship today, then India-US have a deep relationship also because of diaspora. This question also came in 2017 in the main exam. That what is the role of Indian diaspora in Indo-US relationship? But that is a separate issue. I am just giving an example here. No diaspora in Central Africa means Central Africa is a neglected area. And Central Africa is an important area also. Why? Because Central Africa is an area where there are a lot of minerals available, a lot of resources available. So this is the first limitation. Please remember, there are going to be many limitations in India's relationship with Africa that we will see. Keep them in mind very carefully. First limitation is lack of diaspora in Central Africa as a result of its limited engagement. Now, in the modern times, we can look at Africa in two ways. First is the looking at Africa through the prism of Europeans. So in the modern times, very firstly, the European countries were doing industrial revolution. When these European countries were doing industrial revolution, you see these countries basically to do industrial revolution required resources. But the problem is that most of these European countries realize that they don't have resources within their own country. And because they realize that we don't have resources within our own territory, these European countries decided to get these resources from outside. To get these resources from outside, they began to colonize different countries in the world. So please remember one thing, if colonization of the world happened, then colonization was done by the Europeans. Colonization was done by the Europeans for the access of resource. And that access for resource was mandatory for the purpose because they needed resource for their industrial revolution. So when they colonized countries in Asia, they colonized countries in Africa also. So first thing we are trying to say here is that in the modern times, Europeans colonized Africa. Now when Europeans colonized Africa, you see, there were many European countries that colonized different parts of Africa. But British and the French, these two are basically called major colonizers of Africa. They are called what? Major colonizers. Why are they called major colonizers? Because they were the ones who colonized most of the countries in Africa. But you know, when we say that Britain and France were the major colonizers of Africa, it is also important to remember that they were not the only people to colonize Africa. Africa was colonized by many other people from Europe, like for example the Portuguese, like for example Italians, like also Germans, and also the Dutch, etc. Portuguese, Italy, Germany, Dutch, they are called minor colonizers. Minor colonizers because they colonized only few territories in Africa. Most of the territories in Africa were colonized by the British and the French. Now it is also important to remember one more thing, that whenever one country colonizes the other country, they take to the other country their language and culture. That is very common. If Britishers colonized India, they brought to India English language, English culture. It is because of the British only that Indians today are in a position to speak a little bit of English that we are able to have. So whenever one country colonizes the other country, they take to the other country what? Their language and culture. If British and French colonized major territories in Africa, they took their language and culture there also. So today in Africa, the scenario is that the other way of looking at Africa is through the prism of language. In Africa, there are some countries which are called Anglophone countries. There are some countries in Africa which are called Francophone countries. Anglophone countries in Africa are called English-speaking countries. Anglophone countries in Africa, which are English-speaking countries, are countries where they were basically colonized by the British. Francophone countries are countries which are French-speaking countries. And Francophone, which are French-speaking countries, were colonized by the French. So one thing is now another important inference that we need to draw. The other inference that we need to draw is that if India today engages with Africa, then our engagement with Africa can be said is deeper with the Anglophone part rather than the Francophone part. Can we say that our engagement today is deeper with the Anglophone part than the Francophone part? Why? Because India was also a colony of the British. Just like many other countries in Africa were colonies of the British, English acted as a common connector. So our engagement today, if it is deeper with the Anglophone part, please remember, is not deeper with the Francophone part. Because here the countries which are French-speaking countries are countries where India's engagement is not very deep. Why? Because the language acts as a barrier here. This is the second limitation of India's engagement with Africa. Second limitation is that basically language acts as a barrier in the Francophone part of Africa, which is that part of Africa where French is the dominant language. First limitation was lack of diaspora in Central Africa. So keep these things in mind. The modern times can also be seen through the other way. This was basically Gandhi's presence in Africa. So in the modern times, the other way of looking at Africa is the presence of Gandhi in Africa. Gandhi had gone to Africa for the assignment of law in South Africa. When he went to South Africa for a law assignment, at that time, Gandhi basically witnessed what is called as racial discrimination. And not only he witnessed racial discrimination, he also found that the Indian people living in South Africa are also victims of racial discrimination. So when Gandhi saw that there is racial discrimination in South Africa, Gandhi decided to resist it. And the question is, how did he decide to resist it? He basically, while his stay in South Africa, conceptualized a technique called satyagraha. So during his stay in South Africa, Gandhi conceptualized, Gandhi created, Gandhi established a technique called satyagraha. What is satyagraha? Satyagraha is three things. Write down. Number one, it is a technique of mass mobilization. Technique of mass mobilization. Number two, the masses are mobilized to offer peaceful resistance. Masses are mobilized to offer peaceful resistance. Number three, the resistance is offered to fight injustice. The resistance is offered to fight injustice. So you see, satyagraha is a technique which was conceptualized by Gandhi in Africa. Under that technique, Gandhi decided to, number one, mobilize the masses. The masses were the Indians who were living in South Africa. Number two, he mobilized the masses so that they could offer peaceful resistance. The word peaceful means non-violent resistance. So that also means that satyagraha is a concept associated with non-violence. They will offer peaceful resistance to fight injustice, which is racial discrimination. So not only Gandhi conceptualized satyagraha there, he also applied the technique of satyagraha there. When Gandhi applied the technique of satyagraha in South Africa, it also was successful at that time. Gandhi was able to achieve certain results out of this. When Gandhi was able to achieve certain results out of the application of Satyagraha in South Africa, Gandhi eventually understood one thing, that Satyagraha is thereby a universal technique. Gandhi eventually understood that Satyagraha thereby is a universal technique which can be applied in any situation and which can be applied to any situation to fight injustice. So when Gandhi eventually understood that Satyagraha has universal applicability, can be applied in any situation to fight any injustice, this technique of Satyagraha became very close to the heart of Gandhi eventually. Over a period of time, Gandhi came back to India finally in 1915. When he came back to India in 1915, for 1 year, Gandhi decided to tour the entire country to understand the problems of the country. In 1916, 1 year later after Gandhi came back, Gandhi eventually realized that in India the Britishers are resorting to injustice of the Indian people. And as Gandhi realized that the Britishers are doing injustice on Indian people, Gandhi decided to offer resistance to that injustice through Satyagraha. He started mobilizing the Indian people. You see, coming of Gandhi is very important in the nationalist struggle in India. Because before the coming of Gandhi, the nationalist struggle was disconnected from the masses. When Gandhi came, he decided to infuse energy in the masses to bring them together on the nationalist platform. And Gandhi decided to mobilize the masses to resist the British. Therefore, Gandhi decided to apply Satyagraha to the Indian context, and Satyagraha eventually became a core tool of the Indian national movement. Satyagraha eventually became a core tool of the Indian national movement. You see, this is one very important thing to be remembered here. That when Satyagraha became a tool of the national movement in India, the Indian people at that time developed a very special interest for the Africans. Question is why? Because Satyagraha, which was now becoming a tool of national movement of India, was after all conceptualized by Gandhi in Africa. And because that technique was conceptualized by Gandhi in Africa, the Indian people began to develop consciousness about Africa. This is a very crucial thing. That Africa is one territory in the world where Indian people developed the consciousness about that territory before Indians became independent. And the reason why Africa is one territory where Indian people developed the consciousness about it is because of Gandhi's presence on South Africa, is because of Gandhi's creation of Satyagraha there, is also because of application of Satyagraha in Africa and subsequently in India. So these are the three factors which contributed to the development of consciousness amongst Indian people about Africa. So when Satyagraha became a tool in the national movement of India, Indian people became aware about the Africans. As the time progressed, it was in 1927. There was an Afro-Asian conference which happened. This conference happened in 1927 in Brussels, which is in Belgium. This conference in 1927, which happened in Brussels in Belgium, was a conference where countries of Africa and Asia participated. And as countries of Africa and Asia participated in the so-called Afro-Asian conference, one of the participants from Asia was India. As one of the participants from Asia was India, India again got an opportunity to talk to the Africans in this conference. As it is, Indians were developing consciousness about Africa. Afro-Asian conference, which happened in Brussels, was a conference of all countries in Africa and Asia which were under colonial rule. Afro-Asian conference was a conference of countries in Africa and Asia which were under colonial rule. And as countries which were in Africa and Asia were under colonial rule when they participated in this conference, India being a participant from the Asian side, we got an opportunity to talk to the Africans again. And when we got an opportunity to talk to the Africans again during this conference, India's nationalist leaders who were there, they basically told the Africans a very important thing. They told the Africans in this conference that Africa, whenever India becomes independent, we will provide you all forms of assistance to get decolonized. This is a very crucial thing. Nationalist leaders of India who participated in the Afro-Asian conference interacted with the Africans, told the Africans that Africans, whenever we get independent, we will provide you people with all assistance to get decolonized. We promise them help, that we will help you to get decolonized or get independent whenever we become independent. So one thing became very clear. Afro-Asian conference also strengthened India's relationship with Africa before India became independent. Now, when finally India became independent in 1947, India's relationship with Africa at that time can be seen in 5 phases. Phase 1, 1950 to 60. Phase 2, 1960 to 70. Phase 3, 1970 to 90. Phase 4, 1990 to 2000. And the phase 5, that is 2000 till today. So broadly speaking, India's relationship with Africa since independence can be seen in these 5 phases. The first 3 phases are phases that we witness between India and Africa during Cold War. Last 2 phases are basically phases of post-Cold War. These are the 5 phases in which we can divide India's relationship with Africa. Now, let us look at each phase one by one, and let us try to understand that how India engaged with Africa in these phases. Phase 1 is the period of 1950 to 60. You see, one important thing has to be kept in mind, that even though India became independent in 1947, and it officially began its relationship with Africa in the first phase from 1950, but African countries were not independent at that time when India became independent. Some of the African countries became independent in 1950 to 60. Some of the African countries became independent from 1960 to 70. By 1970, the entire Africa as a continent became independent from their colonial rulers. Therefore, number one, it has to be remembered very carefully that 1950 to 60, 1960 to 70 are 2 decades when Africans are getting decolonized. So please keep this at the back of your mind, that 1950 to 60, 1960 to 70 are 2 decades when the Africans are still getting decolonized. 1970 onwards, all the Africans are fully decolonized or independent. So, first phase of India's relationship with Africa, 50 to 60, happens at a time when the Africans are still getting independent at that time. So, let us have a look at the first phase of what happened here. So, in the first phase, this was a historical legacy that acted as a strong foundation to open up the relationship. The historical legacy that we have just talked about, that is Gandhi's presence in Africa, Satyagraha, and the Afro-Asian Conference. Three things. They basically acted as a historical legacy. Now, in the first phase, India adopted a two-point policy. What was the two-point policy of India? The two-point policy was that number one, India decided to support African decolonization and number two, decided to promote non-alignment in Africa. The two-point policy of India in the first phase is very simple. The first thing India tried to do was that India tried to basically support African decolonization. You see, as we have just said some time back, that the Afro-Asian Conference was a platform where India at that time had committed to Africa. That Africa, whenever India becomes independent, we will provide you all assistance to get decolonized. That Afro-Asian Conference commitment was visible in the first point. So we said we will support your decolonization. Second question is, how do we support decolonization? We decided to support decolonization in Africa by teaching them the idea of Satyagraha. After all, Satyagraha was a technique that was adopted by India to get independent. And we have also seen that Satyagraha was not only a technique which we adopted, but Satyagraha is also a technique that India created, Gandhi created in Africa itself. So as Satyagraha was a technique conceptualized in Africa, and as that Satyagraha technique was applied by India in its own territory to get decolonized, India decided to teach the Africans how to use Satyagraha to get decolonized. So we decided to help the Africans to get decolonized for two reasons. One is the Afro-Asian Conference commitment, and second is because Satyagraha was conceptualized by Gandhi in Africa and it was applied by India here, which helped us to get decolonized. So we thought that it is our moral responsibility to help them also learn this technique. So we said it is our moral responsibility. So moral responsibility plus the Afro-Asian Conference commitment are the two reasons for the point number one. Point number two is that we decided to promote non-alignment. As we had discussed earlier also, India basically became a non-aligned country. And India also decided to promote the idea to remain non-aligned to other countries. So Africa was one of the first territories where basically India decided to promote the idea of non-alignment. Let's not forget, African countries are getting decolonized. They are becoming independent. After they become independent, they also have those two options, US, USSR, etc. So it was in our interest at that time to convince them that as you have just now become independent, you should remain non-aligned. So two-point policy of India here helped us to reach out to the Africans. Plus, at the same time in the first phase, Nehru also made certain statements for Africa. For example, one of the prominent statements he made for Africa was that India and Africa are separated by ocean, but connected by histories. So Nehru made a statement that India and Africa are separated by ocean, but are connected by histories. So when Nehru made this statement, Africans were almost in tears at that. It is a very non-controversial statement, as you see. Such a non-controversial, positive statement basically helped India and Africa to create a bridge between each other. Positive, non-controversial statements by head of the states always act as a bridge between two states. So similarly here, positive, non-controversial statement of Nehru with respect to Africa acted as a bridge between India and Africa. Therefore, keeping this in mind, the first conclusion now we can draw is that we can rightly say that the phase 1 is a phase of connect between India and Africa. Phase 1 is a phase of connect. India and Africa are able to establish a connect with each other. The connect happens because of number 1, presence of Gandhi, that is Gandhian factor. Connect happens also because of Gandhian Satyagraha that we have discussed. Connect also happened because of Afro-Asian Conference that also we discussed. Another factor for the connect is India's 2-point policy that we have discussed just now. And lastly, the connect also happened primarily because of the political slogan of Nehru. That slogan that we just saw, called the political slogan. So that political slogan of Nehru acted as a factor of connect. These are 5 important core points that help us to understand the nature of the relationship in the first phase. So these 5 points have to be always there in your mind. They need elaboration. Let us see the phase 2. (1960 to 70). The second phase, that is the phase from 1960 to 70. Number 1 begins with 1962 Indo-China conflict. So when the Indo-China conflict happens in 1962, that is at the beginning of the second phase, the Africans become very upset with India. Because the Africans now, they ask India, India, you have been teaching us the idea of satyagraha, non-violence and all that. Why did you use violence here? So we tried to tell the Africans the reason why this conflict happened is primarily because the Chinese were the ones who had more of misunderstanding over the border. The Chinese were the ones who started this conflict. So even though we tried to give the reason of China to the Africans, they were not very convinced. But as the time followed, in 1965, now there is an Indo-Pak war. Now when there is Indo-Pak war, Africans again ask us the same question. You have been teaching us non-violence, satyagraha and all, and why are you using violence here with Pakistan? So again we tried to tell the Africans. We said the reason why violence happened here is because the Pakistanis attacked us first. They were the ones who dropped bombs on our territory first, because they wanted to snatch away Kashmir militarily. So that is the reason why this war happened. So again when we said this, the Africans were not at all convinced. The problem got compounded further because the Africans also were not getting decolonized. Time period is 1960 to 70. Africans are still not getting decolonized. They are becoming impatient. Why are we not getting decolonized? They started asking India question कि ये कैसी strategy है ये सत्याग्रह non-violence? Nonsense है। हमने कहा यार nonsense को भी तो हम थोड़ी आजाद हो जाते हैं। तो अफ्रीकन से फिर हम क्यों नहीं हो रहे? हमने कहा कि यार ये तो तुम्हारी गलती है इसमें। तो भाई Africans are becoming impatient. They are becoming impatient because they are not getting decolonized. Plus, practically on the ground they witness कि भाई these two things have been happening with India, where India talked about non-violence to everybody, whereas it resorted to violence. So after these two incidents, Africans began to tell India that India, number 1, there is a lot of discrepancy. Africans began to tell us what? They said that in India there is a lot of discrepancy in what you speak and what you practice. You are speaking to everyone about non-violence, but what you practice at home, 60 to 65 is an example of violence. So Africans, number 1, began to tell India that in India there is a lot of discrepancy in your thought and your action. Number 2, Africans, because of that discrepancy in our thought and action as they perceive, Africans began to become disillusioned and upset with India. Why did they become upset with India? They began to become upset with India also because the non-violent strategy was not getting them any result. Why non-violence is a time-taking strategy. Non-violence takes a lot of time because non-violence as a strategy to get decolonized requires mass mobilization. Not only it requires mass mobilization, which is easy to do, but what requires after mass mobilization is to teach the masses the idea of peaceful resistance. You know, for example, if you study the modern Indian history, you will realize that even though Gandhi after 1916 decided to mobilize the masses and decided to teach them the idea to offer peaceful resistance, but there were various incidents that occurred in the modern Indian history when Gandhi realized that people are not ready for non-violence. Classical case is the Khilafat movement. The Chauri Chaura incident which happened where violent activity happened, Gandhi realized at that time. The Chauri Chaura incident in India which happened eventually, where violent activity was done, clearly proved the fact that the people have still not understood the idea of peaceful resistance. So you see, what we are trying to say is a simple thing. The non-violent strategy takes time. It requires tremendous energy by the leaders to realize that the masses have to be taught the idea of peaceful resistance. Problem here is that the Africans are becoming impatient. Rather than trying to teach the idea of peaceful resistance to their masses, they want instant result. And that is basically increasing their impatience today. So as these things were happening, this is what basically China at that time saw as an opportunity. China saw that the Africans are not very happy with India. China saw that the Africans are not very keen to engage with India. And as a result of it, China at that time decided to take advantage of the weakness of India. And in the second phase, China decided to adopt its own two-point policy. The two-point policy adopted by China was this, that China, number one, decided to convince these Africans to go for a revolution. China started telling the African countries that you should go for a revolution to get decolonized. You should be adopting a strategy of violence to get decolonized. It is very natural to understand that why China advocated the idea of revolution is because China itself had a revolution in 1949. Because there was a civil war in China which itself was a violent civil war. And if China became communist in 1949, after the civil war there was violence and bloodshed there. Unlike the violence and bloodshed in the Indian case. So one thing became very clear, that it is natural why China was advocating for revolution. And number two, and more important, is the fact that China also decided to provide economic aid to the African countries. So as China adopted a mixture of revolution plus economic policy, there were many countries in Africa that became interested to apply the Chinese approach. Some of the African countries were of this opinion that non-violence anyway is not giving a result. Plus there is discrepancy in what India speaks and practices. So what is the harm in applying the Chinese approach? And let's not forget, we have just said one very important thing. That the reason what convinced Africans to apply the Chinese approach was because they were becoming impatient. Because they wanted instant results. Non-violence satyagraha does not give instant results. Non-violence satyagraha are time-taking techniques. Revolution may give you instant results, but revolution causes a lot of bloodshed. So all these factors that at that time happened eventually now help us to conclude the second phase. In the phase 2, therefore, we say that China succeeded in establishing a connect with Africa. India therefore gradually got disconnected with Africa. So the final conclusion here is this, that in the second phase, with all these things that happened, China was eventually able to establish a connect, whereas unfortunately India gradually got disconnected from Africa. And that is the reason why second phase is not a good phase for India. But one more thing now happens. If we now go to the third page, (1970 to 90), let us not forget one thing, that by the time of 1970, African countries were now fully decolonized. By 1970, African countries were now fully independent. So therefore, you have to keep at the back of your mind that 1970 onward, Africans now are independent. And from 1970 onwards, as the Africans now are independent, the way now the Africans will look at the world will be slightly different from the way they were looking at the world till now. So now as the Africans are finally independent, India's relationship with Africa in the third phase begins. You see, when Africans gain independence, the very first thing that happens is that these Africans now start searching for role models. And they started searching for role models at the developmental level. You have to understand one very basic thing. Whenever a country gets decolonized and whenever it becomes independent from a colonial ruler, that country always searches for a developmental role model. If you study about India itself, you see in 1917, 1917, when the Russian Revolution happened, and after the Russian Revolution, eventually Russia adopted state-led development, and Russia adopted the socialist model of development. That model of development in Russia inspired a lot of leaders in India. After 1917 Russian Revolution, throughout the 1920s, Nehru from India, who was a nationalist leader, he visited Russia for a very long period of time. Not only Nehru visited Russia, Subhash Chandra Bose also visited Russia. And there were many other nationalist leaders who visited Russia. And all of those leaders tried to understand that how socialist model of development is working there. And as they understood that model, they got very inspired by that model. That is why, one very peculiar feature of our nationalist movement is that throughout the 1930s and 40s, most of the resolutions of the Congress which were passed, most of those resolutions of the Congress always advocated for socialist development in India. And that is why you see when India became independent in 1947, as India at that time had the option of accepting a capitalist model of America or a socialist model, we adopted the socialist model. It is not wrong to say that when India became independent, our developmental role model at that time was Russia. And just like our developmental role model that we adopted was of Russia, Africans have now become independent, but they have become independent by 1970s. The time period of 1947 and 1970s are different time periods. By 1970s, options as the role models for the Africans are many more than that of 1947. And let's not forget, 1970s is the period of Cold War. And not only period of Cold War, sir, be very clear to remember that 1970 is the period of middle Cold War. Because 1990 Cold War got over. 1970 is the middle period of the Cold War. Options available for the Africans now at the role models are many. And let us see those options which are there. For example, number one. First option for Africans was US as a role model. For many countries in the world, US acted as a role model. For many countries in the world, capitalism was a role model. For example, Japan. Japan is a very surprising example. Because after the World War II, Japan realized that the path of development is capitalism. And because after World War II, Japan realized the path of development is in capitalism, Japan adopted capitalism. But Japan also realized that capitalism is an ideology of US. Japan and US in the World War II surprisingly fought against each other. But because after the World War II, Japan realized that the path of capitalism is basically the path for our overall development, immediately after the World War II, Japan and US became allies of each other. And they developed an alliance also. So one thing is very important, that there were many countries in the world for whom US was a role model. And now the same question applies to Africa. That if US is a role model in front of the Africans, then the question is, can the Africans adopt this US as a role model or not? मैं तो बता दूँ। मेरी का क्या मतलब है? Yes होगा, no होगा और क्या होगा? Yes तो क्या रीजन है इसका? Maximum countries are moving towards US, इनको पानी में बोल चली। 1970 का समय चल रहा है अभी। उदावी चलो वो तो ग्राउंड रियलिटी है, वो तो सबके लिए प्रॉब्लम थी यार. इवन फॉर जापान व्हेन वर्ल्ड वॉर 2 happened, let's not forget they witnessed atomic bomb attack. They were devastated, and yet they became a superpower at that time, and they remain a kind of a superpower for that many even today. तो मैन्युफैक्चरिंग सेक्टर ना भी हो तो डेवलप हो ही जाएगा. क्यों रेसिज्म का ब्लैक एंड व्हाइट ब्लैक्स वर ट्रीटेड बैडली इन यूएसए, तो वो तो बहुत साल पहले था यार. वो तो यार इतना प्रॉमिसिंग फैक्टर नहीं है कि ब्लैक एंड व्हाइट रेशियल डिस्क्रिमिनेशन. वो तो आपकी बात सही है, गलत नहीं है तो आप कह रहे हो कि रेशियल डिस्क्रिमिनेशन वाज देयर, बट यू नो व्हेन यू आर सिलेक्टिंग अ डेवलपमेंटल रोल मॉडल एट दैट टाइम यू डोंट सी दीस थिंग्स. Racial discrimination and all might be factors to consider, but not a deciding factors at that time. That may not be very strong, because you see, when we talk about capitalism, it is more market-led rather than mixed economy, what you are saying. One very important thing that our friend says here is very important and right, sir. Please understand one thing very carefully, that America was a spreader of capitalism. Most of the countries in the world which became decolonized, they number one were very allergic to capitalism. And the reason why the countries which got decolonized were allergic to capitalism is because they believed that they were colonized because of capitalism. Let us not forget, sometime back in the beginning only we said that when colonization began, it began because of industrial revolution. And industrial revolution was basically, if something happening at the industrial level, its philosophy was guided by capitalism. Most of the countries which got decolonized in the world were of this opinion, that we got colonized because of a greedy ideology called capitalism. Most of these decolonized countries in the world believe that capitalism is a greedy ideology, and that greedy ideology called capitalism encourages countries to colonize other states. Because if industrial revolution happened in Europe, the foundation and the basis of industrial revolution was the capitalist thought. That capitalist thought, which were the thoughts that guided the European countries, were the thoughts eventually because of which the countries in Europe ended up in colonizing half of this world. That is the reason why the decolonized world, whether that decolonized country was in Asia, whether that decolonized country was in Africa, whether that decolonized country was in South America, the decolonized world always was allergic to capitalism because they believed that they got colonized because of capitalism. You see, this is also one of the very peculiar features if you observe very carefully between India and US relationship. If you study about India-US relationship very carefully, you will observe one very important thing in India-US relations, that throughout the period of Cold War, India was very allergic to US. Not because India disliked the people of US, but India disliked the ideology of US. India disliked the capitalist ideology. Because India also was of the opinion that if the Britishers colonized us, the Britishers were driven by a capitalist thought of industrial revolution for which they needed resources. And if you study about those modern Indian legislations which were passed by the British, from the Regulating Act till the Charter Acts, all those acts had an element of trade. And all those acts which had an element of trade had an element of trade to control the native population. So all the decolonized countries in the world were very allergic to capitalism. That is why even if US was a promising option, considering that US is a capitalist country, considering that as we saw that there were some countries in the world like Japan, etc., that adopted capitalism, the decolonized world of Africa preferred to stay away from capitalism. So therefore, even if US was an option available, number one, countries in the African territory stayed away from US as a role model. And if US was not available as a role model, the next alternative was USSR. If USSR is a role model available, now the question that arises is, can the African countries adopt USSR as a role model, and can they accept Russia now to guide their developmental strategy? By tu bata वहाँ पे बताना मेरे को क्या दिख रहा है बताइए और कुछ बोलता है नहीं बोल फिर रशिया रोल मॉडल बनेगा या नहीं बनेगा? नहीं बनेगा। क्यों नहीं बनेगा? क्या बोल रहा है यार? थोड़ा क्या हो गया? आवाज नहीं आ रही। खाना खा के आया या कागज खा लिया? बता जल्दी बता भाई। यार वो तो कोई रीजन है नहीं कि इंडिया का नाम है। आंसर यू टेल। Will Russia become a role model for Africa or no? Why no? They don't want to believe in other countries philosophy. ये क्या मतलब है? रोल मॉडल तो कोई और ही होगा आपका, खुद अपने रोल मॉडल थोड़ी हो जाओगे। ये क्या मतलब है? आप अपने रोल मॉडल खुद हो, बिना कुछ अचीवमेंट भी दिए। तो तू बता भाई। हाँ क्या आगे क्या आगे यूएस सुपर पावर है तो रशिया के मतलब हाल है। कैसी बात है? तो सुपर पावर है तो बहुत चल रहा है। कमाल की बात है। आपको बता भी वहाँ पे। हाँ अब उसको क्या दिख रहा है? फर्स्ट पेज देखा ना आज Czechoslovakia was an example which was part of the USSR. वो तो कोई नॉलेज नहीं है। आप तो डेवलपमेंटल रोल मॉडल देख रहे हो। नैम में लेकिन डेवलपमेंट क्या है? भूखे देश हैं सारे नैम। सबसे बड़ा लीडर ऑफ भूखा देश जो है वो इंडिया था। नैम से हमने अचीव क्या किया है? तो किसी भी वो RSS वाले वो कहेंगे ये तो मोदी जी होते तो नैम ही ना होता। तो अलग बात है कि जब आजाद हुए 2 साल के very one thing has to be remembered very carefully that even though Russia was a promising option considering that Russia was socialist vis-a-vis the capitalist model of US, first thing to keep in mind is that the Africans were interested to emulate Russia. Africans were interested to have Russia as a role model. But even though Africans were interested to have Russia as a role model, surprisingly, Russia never showed any interest to help the Africans at that time. And the reason why Russia never showed any interest to help the Africans is because Russia said that the Cold War is going on right now. And during the Cold War, our priority is to contain and counter US. So Russia said very clearly that because our priority is to contain and counter US, and as in Africa there is no US because the Americans are not accepted by the Africans. Therefore, we don't want to go to Africa as a territory to help them out. You see, this is a very peculiar situation. Africans are interested to have Russia as a role model. Unfortunately, Russia is not interested to spread their ideology or take the assistance of the Africans to help them in the communist model. And the reason given by the Russians is the Cold War logic. That right now the Cold War is going on. Our priority in the Cold War is to contain US. As there is no US in Africa, we don't want to go to Africa. So despite being a promising alternative here, USSR as an option went out. The next option now was China. China, just now we saw, was a communist country. Plus at the same time in the second phase only of India's relationship with Africa, just now we said that China was basically providing economic aid, teaching the Africans the idea of revolution, etc. And as we also concluded the phase number 2 by saying that China established a connect with the Africans. So considering the fact that China and Africa were now having a good relation at this moment, the question that arises is that despite that goodness, can China emerge as a role model now for the Africans? नहीं तो वो तो इंडिपेंडेंस तो हो गई है। अब इंडिपेंडेंस से कोई लेना देना और इंडिपेंडेंस तो खत्म हो गई। गुलामी वहां गए उधर। हाँ चाइना अच्छा तो वही बेटा साइड में वहां का देख रहा हूँ। हाँ बता देगा चाइना चाइना सर like whether the China will not go or whether Africans will not go for China. Why? That's fine, but if they are industrializing, that is good if you get an option to portray your power in Africa. But anyway, China is communist, they are already pro-USSR. Where is the conflict? तो बता बेटा वहाँ पे कौन एकदम बात नहीं है। क्यों? हाँ तो वो तो ऑब्वियस है यार, पर फिर भी चाइना एक ऑप्शन तो है। चाइना इकोनॉमिक एड भी तो दे रहा था, हमारे पास तो वो भी नहीं थे पैसे देने। हाँ चलो India as an alternative we see separately, but one thing firstly we have to understand about China here is that as he said and as we discussed, China had a good relation with Africa in the past in the second phase. But despite that goodness, it is surprising that Africans never showed interest in China. Reverse of what you are saying. Africans never showed any interest in China because by 1970s, China started becoming an open economy. By 1978, China officially became an open economy. By 1970s, China started becoming an open economy. By 1978, China fully became an open economy. You see, when China eventually became an open economy by 1970s, and China eventually became capitalist by 1970s, most of these Africans at that time began to develop this perspective for China, that if China is an open economy, and if China becomes capitalist economy, then China will not be very different from US. And as most of the decolonized countries which were allergic to US, not because of the US people, but because of their open economy, now started becoming allergic to China also. So despite the fact that China and Africa had a good relation in the phase 2, in the phase 3 when China began to transition towards an open economy, most of the African countries now decided to, number one, stay away from China. So as China, US, USSR as alternatives were gone, the next option was India at that time. But now the question is, was India in a position to offer any kind of alternative as a developmental role model to the Africans? What happened in India? Let us look at India in 1970s. In 1970s, there were two things. Number one, India was able to create an industrial base. And not only by 1970s did India succeed in establishing an industrial base, but more importantly, another important thing that was there was something called Green Revolution. You know, Green Revolution happened in 1966. You are aware of this very basic fact that when India became independent, we never had adequate food production capability to feed our people. So what happened after independence is that we started buying food commodities from different countries in the world. And whenever we purchased the food commodities, we paid in US dollar. We purchased food from Russia, we purchased food commodity from Germany, we purchased it from US. And every time we gave US dollar. And US dollar means that you are spending your foreign exchange reserve. 1962 Indo-China conflict happened. 1965 India-Pakistan war happened. When these two events happened, India at that time realized after 1965 that it doesn't make sense to use the precious US dollar reserves that we have to buy food commodities. After 1965, India realized that whatever US dollar reserves we have today, we should use those US dollar reserves to purchase more strategic things rather than food grains and food products. Therefore, after 1965, these factors compelled India to decide to reduce food grain imports from outside. And this compelled India in 1966 to go for something called Green Revolution. The objective of Green Revolution was simple. The objective of Green Revolution was to become self-sufficient in food production. The word important is production, not productivity. Productivity challenge in agriculture comes much later. India said, number one, we will become self-sufficient in food production. Number two, India said, we are having agroclimatic zones in our country where we can grow crops. That means India said that we are geographically in a position where we can grow crops. एक तो होता है कि you are not geographically in a position to grow crops. For example, Siberia in Russia, completely snow-fed area. Agriculture cannot happen there. India said that is not the case with our country. We are geographically suitably located to grow crops. What we require is intervention by the government, which came in 1966 in the form of Green Revolution. Where government intervention, adoption of technology. Government intervention plus adoption of technology led India to basically become self-sufficient in food production. Green Revolution, which began in 1966, began to show result by 1970. By 1970-71, a lot of commodities in India were now produced domestically. By 1970-71, a lot of commodities were there in India in which we became self-sufficient also. Self-sufficient means that there were some commodities by 70-71 in which we eventually became surplus producers. And this green revolution, which was basically a domestic initiative in India, is something which was perceived positively by other countries around India. Green revolution was a domestic initiative of India, but surprisingly was perceived positively by countries outside India. And one such territory which perceived green revolution positively was basically the territory of Africa. Let us not forget one thing, as we just said, Africans just now got independent. They also needed food grains to feed their people. Those Africans also realized that we do not have money to basically buy food grains. They also realized that we should become self-sufficient in food grain production. And they realized that as India has become recently self-sufficient, we can learn this from India, how they became self-sufficient. That is why we say a very important thing, that the green revolution of India, which was a domestic initiative of India, became a popular foreign policy concept outside India. And that is why, keeping these two factors in mind, Africans now in the third phase, they basically began to relook at India. And as now the Africans began to relook at India with the objective of learning from India about green revolution and an industrial-based creation, India decided to take advantage. India decided to re-engage with Africans, and as India decided to re-engage with Africans, India now decided to use NAM, and India decided to give NAM an economic character. So India decided to use NAM, decided to give NAM an economic character, and this economic character that was given by India to NAM was now used by India to share the best practices of green revolution and industrial development, etc. So NAM, which now got an economic character, was used by India, and this NAM, which now got an economic character, was used by India to share best practices of green revolution, share best practices of creation of industrial base. So as this happened, that is why we say that the third phase is a phase of reconnect between India and Africa. The third phase eventually now emerges as a phase of reconnect between India and Africa, and India and Africa are able to establish a connect again with each other. They are able to reconnect with each other because of whatever unfortunate event happened in the phase 2. The third phase now was a fresh phase. So as they were able to establish a reconnect now, this continued very clearly in the fourth phase, 1990 till 2000. In the fourth phase now, a very important thing has to be kept in mind. In the fourth phase, India became an open economy. You know, the fourth phase is basically 1990 onwards. 1990 is the time period when the Cold War ended. When the Cold War ended, Russia as a model disintegrated. US as the only capitalist model was left. As the international environment, political environment now was such that capitalism was the only model left, India embraced that capitalism. Now India tried to tell the Africans also that Africa, the international political environment has changed. The new international political environment which has changed now requires us to accept capitalism. And this new international political environment, which now requires us to accept capitalism, is the only model left. But India also told Africa that Africa, if international political environment requires us to become capitalist, then we can also gradually become capitalist. There is no need to fear capitalism. We told Africa. Even if capitalism is the only option left, we should go for gradual capitalism. Gradual capitalism means that gradually open up your industries and sectors, rather than opening up all the sectors at one go. India adopted for gradual capitalism. We convinced Africans to adopt gradual capitalism. Africans also adopted gradual capitalism. Gradual capitalism means slowly open up sectors. Don't open up your economy and become capitalist at one go. Gradually become capitalist. For that matter, today also you will understand and appreciate that India right now also is not a fully capitalist country. There are a lot of sectors which still remain under the government control. Railway is a classical example. So we told the Africans to go for gradual capitalism. And not only we told this to Africa to accept the changed international political environment. In the fourth phase now, India told Africa that Africa, we will basically help you specifically for development. And we will help you in development in areas like health, education, environment, etc. So India now in the fourth phase also told Africa, we will help you to undertake development. And development in areas like health, education, environment. That is why we also say that the fourth phase of India's relationship with Africa marked the beginning of development diplomacy between India and Africa. A new chapter between India-Africa relation now opens up. That new chapter between India and Africa now in the fourth phase is called the phase of development diplomacy. Development diplomacy is a phase where India has decided to commit development in Africa. Development in areas like health, education, environment. So this is development diplomacy going on now. In the fifth phase, 2000 till today, India has now become a resource-hungry country. Now in the present times, India has gradually become a resource-hungry country because Indian economy has started growing, and as our economy is growing today, India requires resources for growth. One of the basic resources India requires for growth is oil. Oil is rightly called as the fuel of civilization. And oil is rightly called as the fuel of industrialization. As India industrializes, as India emerges as a civilizational power, India also is a resource-hungry country that needs oil. And as India is a country that needs oil, India today has decided to take this oil from Africa. So please remember for the time being that in Africa there is an availability of lot of oil, and today India trades with Africa tremendously in oil. We will talk about oil again after some time today, don't worry about it. But remember till then that there is a tremendous oil trade between India and Africa today. Therefore today in the fifth phase, India looks at Africa through the prism of energy security. For us, Africa today is crucial for our energy security. And if today Africa looks at India, Africa looks at India for the purpose of support of development. So the new theme in our relationship today with Africa is that when we look at Africa for the purpose of energy security, oil. If Africa looks at India today, they look at India today for the purpose of support of development. And they look at India today for the support of development diplomacy. So therefore, keeping this in mind, your homework number 1 today is to read from the reference book these 7 important pages. The page number 470 to 477. In these 7 pages, pay emphasis to 3 important dimensions here. Number 1, trade picture. Number 2, have a look at the China's policy in Africa. As we have discussed the policy of India here, now you will be in a position to appreciate what is the Chinese policy and how is it different. And the third thing in the 7 pages is the future policy for India and Africa, future areas where we can collaborate. So one thing as a conclusion that can be drawn is that India's relationship with Africa, which began with Satyagraha, etc., has transformed and become energy security and development support today. So this is the transformation in the relationship. Okay. Any issue anywhere in any of the 5 pages? Any question, clarification, doubt anywhere? Both, a mixture of the two. So we can't say that only one way is succeeded, both the ways succeeded. But individual study we don't need to do because in GS that won't be asked. In optional you have to study. In call science optional. Any other issues? Any question, clarification, doubt? Anything you can understand you want me to repeat in the 5 pages? Here, let's go to the next dimension. Significance of Africa for India. Please read the question number 1 and 2 that you have written in the beginning today. Why we study Africa as a whole is because in GS the questions are more continental and regional. In optional, if you have political science, there the questions are bilateral. India's relation with South Africa, Mozambique, like this they ask. But in GS, the questions are continental. 5 questions I have given in the beginning, 4 questions. So those questions have been asked. So please read the question number 1 and 2 that I made you write in the beginning. Do those questions make sense to you now? What is surprising is that both question number 1 and 2 are similar. But both of them were asked in a different year. Answer to both of them is similar in fact. In the second question, you have to begin with page number 4 and 5 and say how are they different from page 1 to 5. And question number 1 is page 1 to 5. तो दोनों क्वेश्चन आसान है, लेकिन इस तरीके के सवाल आते हैं, ज़्यादा मुश्किल नहीं है. Conceptual clarity is required to answer them. ठीक है? Let us go to the next part. Significance of Africa for India. Significance of Africa for India is oil. In one word, where oil basically means oil investment and location. Oil investment and location. So these are the 3 significant factors. This is also the question number 3. Keep that in mind. So let us look at each factor one by one. First is oil. Now if you look at oil, let us first remember the area where oil is located. In Africa, it is North and West Africa. So please go home, please see the countries which are in the atlas in North Africa, see the countries which are in West Africa. Countries which are in North and West Africa are countries which are oil-rich countries. These are the countries that possess the resource called oil. Number 2, oil in Africa was discovered by an American company called Shell Corporation. which told the Africans that what you are using to have a bath every day is oil and not water. The Shell Corporation is the American firm that discovered oil in Africa. After this discovery of oil by the Shell Corporation in Africa, today India is one of the countries that has been at the forefront to buy this oil from Africa. The question that arises is that what are the factors and reasons as to why we buy oil from Africa? So let us see the reasons why India buys oil from Africa. What are those reasons for us to buy that oil? Number one, historical relationship. As we have seen through the different 5 phases in our study till now, that India's relationship historically has been very strong with Africa. So the historical legacy acts as a connector, number one. But let us see 2 more specific points to oil. Number 2, oil available in Africa is of very good quality. This is a very crucial point to understand. What is the meaning of the word that oil available in Africa is of good quality? You see, oil which is available in nature is called crude oil. Right? Oil available in nature which is called crude oil. This oil basically has sulfur. In some areas, the crude oil may have high sulfur. In some areas, the crude oil may have less sulfur. But crude oil will always have sulfur. Problem today is that if the sulfur content in the oil is high, then burning that oil which has high sulfur causes more pollution. But if the sulfur content in the crude oil is less, burning that crude oil with less sulfur causes less pollution. Today, oil which is available in Saudi Arabia and the oil which is available in the other Gulf Cooperation Council GCC countries. The oil available of GCC countries has very high sulfur. In contrast to oil surprisingly available with Iran. Iran is also a Middle Eastern country, but Iran is not a GCC country. It is not a member of the GCC. The members of the GCC are basically all the Sunni countries in the Middle East. Iran is a Shia country. They are not a member of the GCC. They also have oil. But that oil available with Iran has low sulfur. And as Iranian oil has low sulfur, this is one reason, number one, that why India buys oil from Iran. India also buys oil from Saudi Arabia, but we prefer to buy it from Iran. Today, petroleum scientists who are there in the world, over a period of time, what has happened is that these petroleum scientists have developed certain kind of chemicals. These chemicals are chemicals when they are added to the crude oil, they reduce the sulfur content. But let us not forget one thing. If you buy crude oil which has high sulfur and you add chemicals to reduce sulfur, the end price of that oil increases. That is why India has been telling this to a country called US which doesn't have the brain to understand it. That US, when we buy oil from Iran, we save money. And when we buy oil from Saudi, we have to invest more money. You don't like us to buy oil from Iran. Saudi Arabia doesn't like when India buys oil from Iran. When India buys oil from Saudi, Iran doesn't like it. When India buys oil from Iran, Saudi and US don't like it. हमने कहा यार कोई मजाक कर रहे हैं? You will like it, I will not like it. He cannot like it. So India has over a period of time realized. India has realized that Middle East is a volatile area. What has India realized? Number one, that Middle East is a volatile area, where somebody will like or appreciate and accept that we buy oil, somebody will not appreciate that we buy oil. As India has realized that Middle East is a volatile area. This is one reason why India is today looking at different areas to buy oil. And as India today is looking at different areas to buy oil, this is where the historical legacy with Africa comes into play. As North and West Africa have availability of oil, number one, we prefer to buy that oil. Number two, As we said, oil available in Africa is of good quality. Means oil available in Africa also has low sulfur. As the oil available in Africa has low sulfur, India prefers to buy that oil. Third factor here that why we buy this oil from Africa here is oil is available close to the coast. And as the oil available in Africa is available close to the coast, trade in that oil is easy. While location of oil matters a lot. If the oil is available close to the coast, it is easy to purchase that oil and immediately bring it to your country. So there is a quality advantage, there is a locational advantage. Plus, third factor is that India is looking for buying oil from new areas which are not as volatile as Middle East, where the historical legacy of Africa comes into play, where India prefers to buy oil. So keeping these factors in mind, today India has been purchasing a lot of oil, and if you look at the present day statistics, 2019-20, 20% oil we use in India comes from Africa. Government says that by 2025, it will become 25%. See, this piece of statistic is very important here. Present day, 2019-20, 20% of the oil we are using in India today comes from Africa. And the estimate of the government is that by 2025, this will rise to 25%, which proves the point that we justified in the fifth phase, that in the future, Africa will continue to become more crucial for India's energy security. So whenever you have to justify that how crucial Africa is for our energy security, use this piece of statistics and justify it to this. That government's own data suggests the rising energy security significance of Africa for India today. So oil is one factor. Investment. Today, India believes Africa is the next growth pole. Today, India believes that Africa is the next growth pole. And the reason why India believes that Africa is the next growth pole is because India is of this opinion that Africa is a continent where growth in the future is likely to witness tremendously, because it is also a continent of growth. There are various sectors where India is making investment today. First is the health sector. Health is a very promising area of growth in Africa. Africans are also as unhealthy as the Indian people are, and as a result of which health remains a promising priority sector. Number two, pharmaceuticals, which is related to health. If health becomes a promising area in a part of the world, pharmacy is the natural sector to grow. Availability of medicines. Similarly, at the same time, education. India is of this opinion today that India's education systems are basically of the global standards. India is of this opinion that these global standards of education that we impart to our students in India in the colleges and universities is the thing that we need to impart to the people in Africa also, so that after the skill they also contribute to unemployment in the society. The best way to measure unemployment in India is Wajira. 33 batches signifies the extent of unemployment in the society. आप समझ सकते हो? आपसे better कोई नहीं है. Education plus apart from that then automobile. Problem number of aspirants in civil services increases every year. And the beauty is that the vacancies decrease every year, making the competition more tougher every time. But automobile is another promising area. Apart from automobiles, telecom and IT. So these are few sectors where there is tremendous growth potential by India in Africa, and these are areas where India is making massive investments in Africa. Language is a serious barrier. Many IFS officers are way more talented than the IAS breed in India. But the problem is, every IFS officer at least knows one foreign language. By the time of the 10 years of their career, they know 2 to 3 foreign languages. But the problem in Indian Foreign Service with Africa is that we have very less diplomatic staff. So we are understaffed. So even if you have trained people in languages, when you have no adequate number of people, you can't open diplomatic missions. Anyway, it's not your discretion which language you will be trained in, that is decided by the government itself. In IFS, your compulsory foreign language CFL training is by the government. You are not allowed to decide unless you are in the top 20 ranks, where you are given the liberty to choose your rank, particular CFL which is there. Problem in India is that we are understaffed at the diplomatic level. You see, Africa has 54 countries. It's a continent of 54 nations, and India has embassies only in 30 nations. If India has embassies in Africa in 30 nations, China has embassies in all 54 nations. This is the difference between India and China. That is what I told you. Please read that China policy very carefully, because you will understand comparatively that what India has been doing and where is the weakness of India which has become the strength of China too. So that is one of the serious issues in our country. Then apart from the investment and oil, the third factor here is location. India is of this opinion that when we engage with Africa, we get different access to different parts of the world. For example, India says when we engage with countries in West Africa, just above West Africa are countries of Europe. Please go home and again see the atlas. In fact, please carry the atlas from the next time in the class so that you can open it then and there and see also. If India says that when we engage with countries in West Africa, just above the countries of West Africa are European countries. And therefore engaging with West Africa gives us access to Europe. You know, from West African states, France and Spain are very close by. And France and Spain are both gateway to Europe. So West Africa is a gateway to Europe. Similarly, India says that when we engage with countries in, say for example, North Africa, just above North Africa are the countries of West Asia. Engaging with North Africa gives us opportunity to engage with countries of West Asia. And similarly, India says when we engage with countries of, say, South Africa, we get an opportunity to engage with South America on the other side. So you see, one thing is very clear here. Different areas of Africa and India engaging with those areas of Africa, India gets an opportunity to engage with different areas of the world. Engaging with South Africa gives us an opportunity to engage with South America on the opposite side. That is why diplomats of India look at Africa as a transit hub for world trade. That is why Indian diplomats look at Africa as a transit hub for world trade, and that is why we feel that the location of Africa is very strategic for India. It is strategic for India because it gives us opportunity to engage with different areas in the world. So India basically is of this opinion that Africa is a transit hub for world trade. Not only it is a transit hub, its location is strategic because we get access to different areas of the world. Next dimension that we have is India's Africa policy. So as far as India's Africa policy is concerned, there are various programs India has launched here. So you can write down few lines. Sir, please write down quickly because I won't repeat any line. You miss something, you miss something. So please don't ask for repetition again and again. Start writing. The India's Africa policy is based on the idea of assisting Africa in development diplomacy, and engage for the purpose of energy security. India offers diplomatic support in 5 programs. Number 1, Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program. Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program was launched in 1964 with the objective of providing support for capacity building, where India offers consultancy services and skill training. Consultancy services and skill training. Program number 2, Pan Africa, PAN, Pan Africa E-Network, E for electronic, E-Network project. Pan Africa E-Network project was launched in 2010 and was a brainchild of APJ Abdul Kalam, India provides satellite-based services to African states which include mineral mapping, e-commerce, e-education, and e-health. Third program, techno-economic partnership for Africa-India movement. Techno-economic partnership for Africa-India movement is an initiative for 8 countries of West Africa. It is a regional program. Where India provides support for development of infrastructure and low cost technology. Next program, New Economic Partnership for African Development. New Economic Partnership for African Development is launched by African Union, under which India provides support for infrastructure projects like railway development. Next, India-Africa Forum Summit. It is a continental initiative where India engages with African states at the continental level to set an agenda for diplomatic engagement at the bilateral and regional level. Diplomatic engagement at the bilateral and regional level. The summit was conceptualized by the previous Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and the first summit happened in 2008 in New Delhi. The third summit happened in 2015 where a New Delhi Declaration was adopted. Under which India decided to support rural housing, solar technology development, and skill development in Africa. The fourth summit is scheduled for 2020. Okay. So please take out that handout that you have got today in the beginning. Now, you see, this handout is primarily about understanding how to write the answers in IELTS and what kind of questions are asked and how do we structure our answers. But please remember few things before we try to understand how to write answers. Unfortunate problem today is that most of the people, they have this kind of, I say, psychological disorder of doing answer writing practice every day. It is actually a psychological disorder for the simple reason because, why? That the first thing is that you actually have no idea about what you are writing. And number two, even when you write something, you have nobody to evaluate what you write. But the problem is you write because somebody has told you to write, and therefore you write without even realizing that how does it help you. So please understand that in answer writing, unfortunately, there are so many dynamics involved. And it is precisely because of these dynamics which are absent that people happen to eventually fail in the exam. Online media is flooded with answer writing things every day. There are people who charge for answer writing, there are people who offer free also. But what eventually nobody, whether the ones who charge you or whether the ones who provide it free, what they both don't teach you is that number one, how to write that answer. Number two, they don't teach you what is the structure of the answer. And number three, even if they encourage you to write every day just because they feel that it is important to write, they don't evaluate your answer. You see, unless or until nobody tells you that what your answer is and where you are going wrong, then the question is that if you are going wrong and if you keep practicing wrong, it doesn't help you. Honestly speaking, answer writing comes at a very specific time period in your preparation. And that time period normally, as I believe, in my personal opinion, always is after the prelims. The reason is because once you give the prelims exam, you have revised the syllabus 4 to 5 times. Things are well settled in your brain. And that is the time period when you normally don't require to see your notes or books again and again to write an answer, and you write them without seeing. That is where the challenge is. In the exam, when you have to write answers, you can't take your books and notes with you. And second thing is that, some people have this problem, which is one of the manifestations of the disorder, that they feel that, we will read something on the internet or somewhere something, and immediately we will write an answer of that. The problem with that kind of an approach is what, that you restrict your brain only to that limited information. Your brain stops functioning beyond that piece of information. Anyway, I am not concerned about all those things because you will eventually realize that after failing a few times in the exam. That's not my concern. But my concern is that at least in my subject, that is IR, when you write answers, first thing is that you should write something of good quality. And second thing is that my idea is to help you out with this idea, that if you write an answer, that what answer is all about and how to structure an answer. So please keep few things in mind. First important thing about an answer, whether it is in IR or any other subject, is the structure. The structure of the answer means three things, introduction, body and conclusion. What is very surprising to me is that 99% people I have observed, online, offline, are people who have absolutely no idea about these three things. And not only they don't have idea about these three things, I have seen online specifically, they misguide you more rather than guiding you. You see, when it comes to an introduction in an answer, let's not forget one thing, sir, that the introduction is the most crucial part of your answer. You know why? Because in the exam, when you are writing an answer, the examiner does not know who you are. He does not know what your qualification is. He does not even know how many books you have read in your life. He only knows you through your answer, and in your answer, he first knows you through your introduction. Your introduction is the first place where you create an impact in the mind of the examiner. And trust me, sir, those examiners who are evaluating your UPSC answer are people who are far more educated than you are. And they already have preconceived notions in mind. The first 2 to 3 lines of their answer that you write, the moment they read, they develop their perception. I will give this many marks to this fellow. They are exceptionally trained people. Your job as an aspirant is to put that examiner at ease. Your job as an examinee here is to put the examiner in a situation where he develops an interest to read your answer. Unfortunate fact is 98% answers are of so poor quality that examiners don't even bother to read. And even they read because of the part of the fact that they are getting payment for it. They read only to give you negative marks. This is the second important thing, In UPSC, you get negative marks for your answer. And this is one very important reason is why UPSC does not disclose the answer sheets of even the ones who qualify and even the ones who don't qualify. The UPSC was dragged by some aspirants to the Supreme Court of India. And the Supreme Court of India, the case was that they had filed RTI applications to get their answer sheets. The Supreme Court said, ask the UPSC, would you like to provide the answer sheets? They said, no, we will not. Because once we start providing answer sheets, the people will start questioning us unnecessarily. That why did you give me negative marks here? You write something stupid is the reason why you get negative marks. Let's not forget that. UPSC will never disclose your answer sheet. And I am very surprised to see these days that there are toppers answer sheets going on online. They are not UPSC answers, they are coaching the answers. Anybody can write and say this is a topper answer. Did that fellow write in front of you? You are a fool. That you believe something that's stupid also. So please don't fall into these unnecessary traps, sir. It's a very serious matter about your career. If you are really dedicated of making through the civil services in 2020, then please make sure that you have the right approach. Because this exam is all about approach, number one, and it is all about the dedication that you display with that approach. And I will not lie to you, you will eventually understand it yourself. This exam also requires a tremendous amount of hard work. It is not passed by people who have no dedication. And I am sure Ravindran sir in the very first class must have told you about the requirement of 10 to 12 hours of study every day. Which I wonder even 1% of you are doing because you count the classroom coaching also as part of the 10 to 12 hours. That is not counted, sir. Because the time you are sitting in the class is not the time of self-study. But anyway, let's not go into those issues. They are very unpleasant as of now for you. You are already in September. You realize it too. But the fact of the matter is that when you write an answer, three things are important. As I said, the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. So please open the page number 2. In the handout, and please write down where the word introduction is written. Write down few lines that I will explain you that. So write down here an introduction is a summary of the answer. A summary of the answer where you tell the examiner in brief that what the answer shall consist of. What the answer shall consist of. The standard practice is that in a question of 100 to 150 words, standard practice is that in a question of 100 to 150 words, introduction is in 2 lines, and in a 200 to 250 word question, it is of 3 lines. There should be no capital no. There should be no definitions, quotations, and unnecessary data ever in an introduction. It is always designed in a formal paragraph with no bullet points. You see, one important thing to remember here is that a lot of people have this misconception that when you write an introduction, your job in the introduction is to tell the examiner about the definition. As I told you sir sometime back, the examiner is far more educated than you. He doesn't need definitions of the question, And this is the first problem, because unfortunately when you happen to write the so-called answers which are online, offline, whatever you write, that bullshit that you write also doesn't teach you this. Rather they indoctrinate you and radicalize you by saying you should write definition. Please remember sir, you are writing a UPSC formal answer for civil services, not a college answer. Unfortunately, those people who teach you this activity of writing definition in the introduction are people who have yet not come out of the college mentality. In UPSC answers, number one, definitions are not required in the introduction, sir, because firstly there is no space for all that. And second thing is, not only there is no space to write an introduction, but it is not even required to write there. Second thing important to keep in mind is that when you write an introduction, you should never give a quotation. Some people have this very weird habit. They will begin an answer with a quotation. Just because they have memorized the quotation, they don't care whether it is related to the topic or not. I memorized 5 quotations on terrorism. Question on terrorism came, I will write quotation. अरे question को पढ़ लेता नहीं. Quotation लिख दिया आपने. यार question is of 150 words. You write a quotation. Quotation takes up 30 words. You are already finished. Your life is gone. You have wasted 30 words on something which is absolutely stupid. Are you getting that? And third thing is that please make sure that when you again write an introduction, you never give irrelevant or any kind of data. They are not asking you any factual data things in the introduction of your answer. How does it help? It doesn't help. These are things which you have to learn. These are things which you have to internalize. These are things you have to keep in your mind. And trust me, sir, as I said, introduction is your first impression on the examiner. He decides about you and your answer and that entire answer script that he holds in your hand through the first introduction that you write in your hand. Because that is the first impression you will give. So please make sure, number one, that there is no definition ever. Number two, there is no irrelevant data also. You have to be very careful about this. Because unnecessarily, if you give these kind of things, they will never give you marks. Read the question number 3 in the handout here. You will understand that question we discussed it for. Read that question. Question number 3 is a simple question. See how is India's approach to Africa is different in the post-Cold War period than from the Cold War. Unfortunate problem in such a kind of an easy answer is also that we have multiple stupid kinds of people with us. Some people will write in the introduction the definition of Cold War. Are they even asking that? Some people will go a step further. They will write definition of post-Cold War. आज तक scholars ने post-Cold War की definition नहीं सारी तुमने निकाला. ये तो फिर भी ठीक है. एक लेवल इससे भी अलग निकालना है. उनका तो आंसर ये वाली क्वेश्चन का स्टार्ट ऐसे होगा. अफ्रीका इज अ कॉन्टिनेंट. भाई इस अंदर नशा करके आया है. उसको नहीं पता अफ्रीका कॉन्टिनेंट है. उसको लगा वो जनरेटर है. मतलब पागल हो यार. ये क्या तरीके का आंसर हुआ? भाई वन थिंग इज वेरी सिंपल. इससे भी क्या मुझे मिलेंगे? कहीं तो ऐसा ब्यूटीफुल इंट्रोडक्शन लिखते हैं, इंडिया अफ्रीका गुड फ्रेंड्स. शादी कर ले. पागल किस्म का ये कैसा इंट्रोडक्शन है? इंडिया अफ्रीका गुड फ्रेंड्स. भाई प्लीज रिमेंबर, don't forget this fact. Introduction is your impression to the exam. No definition, no unnecessary data at any cost. What is the introduction then? The first word that you have written in the introduction is the summary of your answer. This is where the challenge is. That how do you summarize the entire answer that you are going to write in 2 to 3 lines? The introduction is always the summary or the essence of the answer. This question, which is question number 3, is a very simple question. There are 5 phases that they are asking here to discuss. Everybody knows the answer of this question, sir. There are 5 phases. But my question to you is, how do you summarize those 5 phases that we have discussed in 2 to 3 lines? That is the introduction. Introduction is always the summary, it is the essence. Because in the first 2 to 3 lines, you have to tell the examiner in this answer that India's relationship with Africa, which was historically based on concepts like Satyagraha, eventually became economic when NAM adopted an economic character to that of energy security and development diplomacy today. In one single line, you use 4 to 5 powerful words to summarize the entire progression from historical Satyagraha to energy security today. And in that very 1 to 2 lines, the examiner will read and understand that this person's answer is going to have analysis from the historical Satyagraha to energy security today. Trust me, sir, it is the most difficult to write an introduction in an answer. Because in a body you can write it. Body of this answer are the 5 phases. कोई भी लिख ले. Some people will memorize the 5 phases, each and every word, write all of them. Some people will miss some points, it's okay. But everyone will write, but nobody, what they will lose marks at is at the introduction. These are the 2 most important things. Introduction and conclusion of the answer. Body, everybody writes. Are you getting this, sir? The introduction is what, sir? Please be careful to remember this and memorize it by heart. It is the summary of your answer. This is where the challenge lies. That before you sit down to write an answer, you have to think that if this is the answer, then what are the core words of that answer, what are the core thoughts of that answer, and how do I summarize those core thoughts of that answer into that? Because that is what your introduction is. For nearly 40 to 50 answers that you will practice, sir, you may require a lot of thinking capability to design an introduction. But after practice of 40 to 50 answers, trust me, sir, you will develop a natural ability to write introduction. But this requires a tremendous effort. This requires tremendous sitting down with the points and thinking before you write. And this requires you to also, at the same time, evaluate that what you are writing is sensible or senseless. Which is the place where you happen to be. Because what you write, nobody knows what you write. And I am very sorry to say that I am one person who never believes in this called something known as the stupid thing called as model answer. ये क्या मतलब है model answer? Who can create a model answer? Nobody can create a model answer. For that matter, file an RTI application in the UPSC, they will tell you, even the UPSC also never gives a model answer. It's written on the UPSC website. On the UPSC website, there is a RTI segment, go there, read the questions on which they have given responses. UPSC also says we never give model answers for GS questions, we give it only for optional questions. That means even for a GS answer, the answer depends upon the sole discretion of the examiner. When there is no such concept of model answer that exists, sir, how can you write something and compare yourself with something which is irrelevant? Please become more strategic in your preparation, sir. I am telling you again and again. Everybody studies the same thing. Everybody does the same hard work. And yet only 800 people make it to Mussoorie every year. There is a reason behind that. Identify it. That's why. Everybody gives the same exam, sir. Everybody reads the same book. Everybody reads Lakshmi Gandhi. Why doesn't everybody become a IAS? Think about it. There are places where you go wrong. And not only you go wrong, sir, at times you go drastically wrong. You do the hard work. Nobody is questioning your hard work, sir. You are all hardworking people. You are all dedicated people. You have decided to devote 1 year of your life for this preparation. So nobody is questioning your capability, sir. But what we are questioning is the direction in which you put your effort. Let that direction be right. Don't unnecessarily waste your time writing answers, nonsensical answers every day, sir. Write 2 answers in a week, but write them what the UPSC demands. Design your introduction. This is where the challenge lies. Are you getting this? So introduction is clear. It is the summary of your answer. It is the essence of your answer. In a 150 to 200, 100 to 150 words, it is 2 lines. 200 to 250 words, 3 lines. That's the standard practice. You cannot overshoot it. Write down what is there in the body. A body consists of relevant research points, that detail out the answer. That detail out the answer. The factual points in a body can be put to bullet points. And the diagrams can also be used to summarize the essence of the answer. Otherwise, the body is always in a paragraph. Otherwise, the body is always in a paragraph. You see, this is the next most important thing you have to remember. If there is something that you are writing in your answer which is factual, then that factual point can be put through the form of bullet points. If there is something in your answer which you feel you can summarize by giving a diagrammatic approach, feel free to use a diagram. When we were discussing the first phase of India's relation with Africa, the conclusion we drew was the first phase is a phase of connect. Because of that diagram which we drew, which we said number 1 is the Gandhian factor, number 2 Satyagraha, number 3 Dupat policy, etc. That diagram is the essence of the first phase. When you are writing the answer to the question number 3, you can write the answer to the question number 3 by using the first phase through a diagram, giving that diagram first to the examiner, 4 points, 5 points there to the examiner, then use 3 to 4 lines to elaborate them. Because once the examiner directly sees the diagram, he understands at least you have mentioned the 4 points in the diagram, he knows you will be in a position to elaborate because you have knowledge. But if you remember very carefully, sir, that the diagram we used was only for phase 1, we never used it for phase 2, we never had it in phase 3 or phase 4 or phase 5. That means that use a diagram only when it is possible. At times, if there is no possibility to use a diagram, sir, there is no need to use a diagram. If there is something which is factual, put it in the form of bullets. If there is something which is not factual in your answer, no need to put it in the form of bullets. And if there is nothing factual and if there is no diagram, the last thing is that the answer is always in the paragraph. You are writing a formal answer. Many people, unfortunately, again online, offline, misguide you by saying write bullet points. Do you know that they deduct marks for it? You are writing a formal UPSC answer. Through those 75-80 answers that the UPSC makes you write in the mains examination, they try to see, they try to judge that if you happen to become a civil servant tomorrow, whether you will be in a position to write a formal 150 to 250 word report for internal government use or not. And that report is a formal paragraph report. Body, if has nothing factual, should always be in a paragraph. There has to be an element of some formalness in your answer. Answers are always formal. Never casual answers. You are not writing college answers here. Please understand that. And write down in the conclusion. The answer should never be abruptly ended. Answer should never be abruptly ended. And the conclusion should have number 1, a positive point. Number 2, a futuristic suggestion. And number 3, a point which is non-repetitive. From the body above. Non-repetitive from the body above. The next place to create an impact in your answer after introduction is the conclusion. For some people, the conclusion is never there. आंसर लिखना शुरू किया अगला पेज आ गया, अगला आंसर आ गया. कंक्लूजन कहाँ है इसका? भाई एक ये कैटेगरी है, एक इससे अच्छी कैटेगरी है। वो क्या करती है, जब आंसर खत्म हुआ, अब समझ आ गया, आगे कुछ लिखने का है नहीं, लास्ट लाइन लिख देंगे, देयरफॉर इंडिया अफ्रीका कमिंग क्लोजर, ये हो गया, ये देख ले अपने आप समझ लिया होगा। यही QED क्वेड अमॉन डेमोन्स्ट्रेशन एंड प्रूफ ले कि भाई आरडी शर्मा तो नहीं मार रही है, ज्योमेट्री है भाई। conclusion should always be there. First thing is that conclusion is always on a positive tone. Even if the answer asks you to critically examine or critically analyze, your conclusion will still be positive. Answer can never ever end on a negative point. It always is a positive point. And that positive point, number 2, the most important thing in the conclusion, the second point, is a futuristic suggestion. Unless or until you do not tell the examiner that this is where we are and this is where the future is of the relationship here, say for example between two states, your conclusion will always be incomplete. In the 5 phases of India's relation with Africa, what is the 5th phase conclusion? See, we are at energy security development diplomacy. But that is where the situation present is. The question is, from here, where do we go? That is what I told you in the third part of your homework, the future areas. They are given on page number 477. There are 10 future areas there. Even if you read those 10 future areas, memorize 3-4 of them and recollect, and out of that write even 1 or 2. That is where we will say that this is if we are here. We take the relationship of India-Africa to these future areas ahead. A conclusion always is a futuristic suggestion. And that positive futuristic suggestion you write in the conclusion. The third thing is, it is non-repetitive from the body above. Are you getting this? If you write in the conclusion a point which you have already written in the body above, not only you are repeating the same point, you are eating words for which you will not get marks. Every single word you write in an answer in GS carries certain marks associated. Be careful about that. And the last and the most important thing to remember, which you can open the first page of the handout and write. On the cover page, I would say you write. On the main cover page, you write, in capital you write, that do not exceed the word limit at any cost. Do not exceed the word limit at any cost. If a question is of 150 words, examiner is not going to count your 150 words. But those people are experienced to know that where 150 words end and where further words go. And trust me, sir, if there is a question of 150 words, it is better to write 145 words or 140 words rather than writing 155 or 160 words. There are some examiners who are so particular and strict that a few extra words, they get the liberty to cut your entire answer and give you a 0. And you will keep wondering, I wrote exceptionally well, I didn't get marks. Maybe you didn't get marks because your answer script was in the hand of an examiner who was so particular about the word limit that every 2, 3, 4, 5 extra words that you wrote, he deducted marks. And you do this activity for 3 or 4 answers, from the 5th answer onwards, he will start giving you negative marks. This is the reason, sir, why UPSC does not disclose answer sheets. Because they know that we have detailed out a description that what we expect, and people always move beyond that. So be very particular, sir. Come what may, you will not shoot the word limit. This is where again the practice lies. When you start writing answers so-called online and offline, you at times do come across questions where you have knowledge. And surprisingly, when you do come across such questions where you have knowledge, you become outright emotional. बड़ा अच्छा आंसर लिखा. Sir, please stick to what the UPSC demands. Unfortunate problem is this is where your control goes a little heavier and you lose marks. Please revise what we have discussed today in the 5 pages. Please revise your homework of the 7 pages. Get this handout again in the next class. In the next class, we will discuss the next topic, but we will write the answer to question number 3 in the class. And then we will see where you went wrong, where you did not go. Revise and come, then only you will be in a position to write. And you will write without seeing. Fine? So we will continue from here in the next time and with the next class.